Free State Premier Jessie-Anne Bird says in the past year, her province recorded about 6,459 children between the ages of 15 to 19 years who've given birth. This follows the most latest teenage pregnancy statistics announced by the Gauteng government a month ago.
Mona Free State fela di kgweding tse 9 bana ba ka bang within a year bana ba ka bang 6,469 ba dilemong tse 14 tse 15 to 19 ba ile ba thola bana selemong sena 6,469. Those are the children ba ile ba fumana bana selemong sena.
Meanwhile, about 872 young children were reported to have been raped between April 2020 and last month.
Bana within 10 years and 19 years ba go khodileng ba tswanyetsa di abortion ba entseng abortion because ba sa batle bana ba bang boholo ba bona ba rapeuwe ke bana ba 872.
Now, with teenage pregnancy reported to have jumped 60% in Gauteng alone since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, what does this reveal about our societal ills in South Africa, and what impact does this have on already existing social issues? Here to talk to me about this, I'm joined by the social justice activist and chair of the Sexual Reproductive Justice Coalition Board, Lebo Ramafoko, as well as education psychologist and member of the Educational Psychology Association of South Africa, Jessie-Anne Bird. Good evening, ladies, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on Infocus. As Lebo, we've been having this conversation since the numbers in Gauteng have come out, and of course there are various nuances to it. If you look at the ages of the teenagers who are getting pregnant and what is actually happening in society, are we asking the right questions, and are we getting to the bottom of what's actually happening here?
Thank you for having me. Indeed, it is worrying that we have been having this discussion, but not only since the start of or the revelation of the crime statistics, but this is what activists have been saying, that on the main, homes are not safe spaces for women and children. And what you are noticing, particularly with the various lockdowns that we have had, is that indeed that is sadly come to pass, that homes are not safe. And I think there's the issue of, are we asking the right questions? I think we are. I think activists and those that have worked with children like the Teddy Bear Clinic have been saying the same thing. But are we seeing the kind of skill and will to address the issue? I think that is something that we needed to ask ourselves. I don't think, sadly, that it is hardly surprising that this is happening, particularly because South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. And I don't think that when that is happening, the kind of breakdown of community, breakdown of family, and just the inability for us to hold those that are raping children and making them fall pregnant, I don't think it should surprise us. I think we need to ask ourselves, what is happening in society, and what will it take, in particular because various political parties at this point in time are out and asking community members to campaign, and they are campaigning and asking community members to vote for them. Given the fact that the majority of voters are women, we need to be asking those that are campaigning, particularly at a local government level, what it is that they are going to do to make sure that children and women are protected in the various communities where they are campaigning.
Jessie-Anne, as we campaign, of course, we've got to count the costs and ask the question, what is the psychological impact of this development on our teenagers at schools, firstly, but then we also need to talk broadly about where the psychology of society is sitting for this to be happening?
You know, it's interesting that we start with the question of what is the psychological impact of a teenage pregnancy, whereas the question we should be asking is what is the psychological risk that leads to the teenage pregnancy? Something that we've seen in research over and over again is that a teenager in distress is more likely to be a teenager that falls pregnant. A teenager that is not emotionally, psychologically, physically and financially supported is more likely to end up with an unplanned pregnancy. And this is what we need to think about, is that there is this correlation between psychology and unplanned pregnancy in adolescence, but we also need to look at the direction it goes in, because that will tell us where we need to focus our efforts and where we need to focus our support. But to answer your question, it is incredibly distressing for a teenager to face an unplanned pregnancy. Yeah, we're facing many, many challenges here. The first one is around that we'd think about would be education, especially in South Africa, where we do have difficulty with keeping our young girls in school, especially in our more impoverished communities. The other side would be issues around stigma and shame, and potentially facing rejection from peers and family and the school community itself. We also need to think about the long-term effects of the stress of this pregnancy, and if they go on to have the child, how that could impact them. On the developmental level, these are still children. These are people still in need of their own parenting. The burden of becoming parents at this age is incredibly, incredibly tough, often for children who are not very well supported.
Yeah. Let's pin it there. I think you ask a very important question. So let's take that back. That distress that is directly linked to teenagers falling pregnant. What are the gaps that need to be exposed?
So I think one of the very big questions that we need to ask, and we need to ask this one loudly and clearly, is not necessarily so much about why are these teenage girls falling pregnant. I would really like to focus the conversation on who is impregnating them.
Yeah.
And what factors are we seeing that leads to this? You know, what we've seen through so much of the research is that very few of the fathers are teenage boys. Many of them are adult men. And I think I'd like to hand over to Lebo, I think, to go a little bit more into that.
Yeah. Lebo, let's get a little bit more into that. We are aware of the teenage pregnancy. As you mentioned, we have been aware. It's something that has been reported on continually. Where are we getting this wrong? Are we getting this wrong at sex education in schools? You're saying it's at home, society, much needs to be focused there. What is the conversation that we need to be having there?
So I think for me, when you do not hold men and boys accountable for their actions and you make the whole issue of pregnancy, generally speaking, the responsibility of a woman, that is where you are holding it wrong. I mean, we've got a Maintenance Act in South Africa. You can just take a sample in any society and listen to what women are saying about how many of them, some of them earning very little, are supporting children with men who go scot-free. Even when we've got a law that says it is the responsibility, it's actually a criminal case not to support children. If you can talk to many, many children who grew up in homes where the men, we have allowed men in the society to go scot-free. There are also no social consequences for teenage pregnancy. We still moralize youth sexuality. We still want to talk about it in moral codes, and in many instances, not even acknowledge that young people will have sex. But we also have largely predatory behavior by men, and we are not holding men accountable. These 10-year-olds, these 14-year-olds on the main are not impregnated by their peers. They are impregnated by men older than them. And in any society, even amongst some men that we celebrate, that we think highly of them, that are accomplished, we have heard stories, we have heard how they would have 15 firstborns and they would have children with as many women as possible without even the social consequences, let alone the legal consequences. And you also see that at a societal level, people do not really understand, what is child abuse, what is statutory rape, and they do not have the support, So for an example, if a 10-year-old or a 14-year-old child gets pregnant, you ask yourself, what was the safety net in that child's life? What kind of a home is that child growing up in? And when I talk about a home, I'm not victim blaming the grandmother or the parent or the aunt who is looking after the home. I'm talking about what is the kind of society, what is the safety net that society has? Who is noticing when our mothers are leaving? They are the only breadwinners. They are leaving home at 4 o'clock, at 5 o'clock in the morning to catch 2 or 3 taxis to get to work. And they will be back at 6 o'clock. Who is looking after these children? What programs in communities do we have? After school programs to make sure that these children have eaten, to make sure that these children are looking after themselves. When women come into our homes, into homes like mine, and they are here to look after my children because of economic migrancy, they are leaving their own children unattended to come and work in the kitchens, as we call it. What is in place to make sure that their children are taken care of? So, you need to look at inequality and inequity and what is happening at a community level to make sure that, you are supporting some of these families. And let me say this to you. I think what often frustrates me in South Africa is that at community level, there are some people who have found, ways in which they can support each other. I do, for an example, from a community that I come from, have a young woman that, I know I grew up with, who is working with other unemployed teenagers to run an after-school center. The problem becomes very few of these initiatives are supported and are supported at scale. We are not seeing community action and community initiatives being supported. And I think that is part of where the challenge is how are we, given the level of inequity that is there, how are we going to even ask local government, without being political, without being party political, supporting initiatives that are out there? How are we going to support, for an example, mothers, grandmothers to come together and maybe take care of these children, understanding that, between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock, when parents are traveling home, the children may fall prey? How are we talking and really doing parenting courses and parenting interventions?
Right.
How are we having boys mentoring? How are we holding men accountable? How are we helping communities to understand that we shouldn't even be calling it teenage pregnancy? We should be calling it statutory rape. And we should be making sure that we hold men who sleep with 14-year-olds accountable. Until that happens, we will be speaking, unfortunately, over and over and over again.
Speaking of parenting intervention, when we come back, Jessie-Anne, I want to ask that question in particular, if there is psychological support for young girls to work through that trauma of now being parents and what needs to be done. But also, how do we deal with this without making an excuse for it? Predatory behavior in society as communities. That is justice activist Lebo Ramafoko with us and education psychologist Jessie-Anne Bird. We'll continue in a moment. Stay with us on Infocus. On Infocus tonight, we're in conversation with social justice activist Lebo Ramafoko as well as educational psychologist Jessie-Anne Bird. Jessie-Anne, before the break, I mentioned, because we have to, I suppose, have this conversation both ways. What do we do to help the teenagers who are now in this situation? But also, let's get to the root of it at community level. Lebu mentions the issue of predatory behavior, right? That in itself is a psychology all on its own. How do communities, how does society deal with that predatory behavior?
So I'm going to address that question in 2 parts. And I think that one is to think about how we can work in a preventative way to protect our young girls. Something that we see more and more again is that sexual abuse and coercive sexual behaviors, things like assault and rape, but even, using things like money to obtain sex, this relies on a taboo. It relies on a culture of secrecy where people cannot talk about what is happening. One of the ways that we challenge this is we open conversations. As parents, as families, as communities, we open the conversations about sex with our young ones. We want them to know what it is, what their bodies are, what their bodies can do. And through that, we then bring in the guidelines about, what they should be doing, what they shouldn't, what is dangerous, what is safe, what is appropriate, and how to tell the difference. It is through that if we start removing some of that taboo and we start removing some of that fear of talking, we then open up the space for our adolescents to ask questions when they feel uncomfortable, for them to ask for help, and very, very importantly, for them to tell somebody that they trust when they are feeling coerced or unsafe. And I think this is the conversation that we need to be having. How do we help these youngsters protect themselves in a world that can be so very, very, very dangerous? I think the next part of your question spoke about, now that we have pregnant teenagers, what do we do?
Yeah.
How do we support them?
Yeah.
I think one of the first things I want to emphasize here is that we need to remove the shame and we need to remove the stigma. These are young people in need of help going through a very frightening time, needing to make very, very big decisions that people shouldn't have to make at their age. And this is where they need the support and the love of their family members. I know in previous generations, they would very quickly be kicked out of school, and this still happens today in some areas.
Yeah.
They might be shunned by their parents or their loved ones or their churches or communities. And this is what we want to prevent, because they're pregnant. We can't just undo that. We can't just change that. Whatever their decision is going forward, they're going to need somebody to help them pick up their pieces and plan the way forward for the rest of their lives.
Yeah. Most importantly, I mean, as they return to school, some of them will and not all of them will return to school. But the question becomes, are the schools equipped and ready for their return, and what do they need to know as far as support is concerned?
I don't think one can ever answer a question generally about schools in South Africa, because we've got such a diversity in terms of our schools and their resources, attitudes, classroom sizes, teacher preparedness. I think the one thing to emphasize, though, is that these are still adolescents. They are still in need of education that is still protected as a right, and that needs to be emphasized. They also are likely to need support. They're likely to need psychological support. If they've had a child that might have been quite traumatic for them, they may very well need to have additional therapy or counseling, especially if the circumstances around the pregnancy and the birth were quite traumatic or frightening. Additionally, they may need a bit of additional time to settle back into the school environment, and the school may need to help them in terms of planning their study times and keeping up with their schoolwork. Because, obviously their burden of work, if they have a young baby, will be very, very different to that of some of their classmates.
Lebo, as we mentioned, some of them will return. Others are not going to return. I don't know if in our communities and in society and within the policy space and in our interventions, we are thinking about that. I mean, we talk a lot about qualified graduates without employment, but what is going to be the impact of this with those who are not going to return?
So I want to come in on a number of issues, including what we discussed earlier, the previous question. So there is an understanding, and it's not only an understanding in our country, it's a global understanding that Black women in particular can bear pain. And that in fact, when Black women bear pain, it is a sign of strength. And that is why we even call Black women mbokodo, and we say it so unquestionably. And what you see happening is the fact that because we grew up, generations and generations of our parents grew up without psychosocial support, and where women basically, carried various wounds, we expect these young people to do the same. So often what happens in communities, in families, in schools is that nothing is being said. You are lucky if there is a grandmother or somebody at home to look after your child for you to go back to school. But the trauma that you carry, the fact that the boy may still be going to school, the man may be married in the community, the father may be around, you have not even told anybody who the father is, becomes your shame. But life goes on. And in a lot of ways, when you fall apart, whether it is even through postpartum depression, which any woman can get, let alone the fact that you are watching your changes to your body, you don't know what is going on. The understanding is that when you are a Black girl in particular, you strength, we are cleaner, and you just go on. And what it means is that we then undermine the psychological trauma that many Black women have experienced. And in fact, we even stigmatize weakness or tears in Black women. And I remember one interview that I did with a 17-year-old mother who said, all I can do to take out my frustration is to scream at the child. So what you are seeing is that there is trauma that is generational, that gets visited on children. And another study that was done by the Department of Basic Education and Department of Health a number of years ago, I don't remember which year it was, also showed that if for 4 years a young girl cannot go back to school, they are then trapped in poverty. if they've dropped out at grade 9, they've dropped out at grade 11, they are not ever able to go to school. And so a child who is probably from a very fragile community, from a very fragile home, becomes fragile. And then the discourse that we have in our homes and in our society is that, well, you are big enough to have a child, go and find a way in which you support this child. And you also then become susceptible to this predatory behavior. Because even when a man is not treating you well, as long as they are, giving you some money. So the idea that we need social security, the idea that we need at the very basis to have a safety net in our communities is key, because we need to have resources that support young women. By the way, not every pregnancy must be carried to term. We should also come to terms with the fact that one of the options that young women have and older women is the right to abortion, and it is legal in South Africa. And the less we moralize around these issues and we deal with the reality of it, is the more that young people, as Jessie-Anne has mentioned, will speak freely about sex, but also when they are pregnant, they will also be given the kind of advice that they need to make decisions about their bodies. And when and if they decide to keep the pregnancy, there has to be safety nets in society. But the preventative measures mean to say what it is that we are building in our communities to make sure that even if young people have sex, and I'm not talking about 14-year-olds, 14-year-olds, it's sexual abuse. What these statistics need to tell the Department of Health, the Department of Social Development, the Department of Basic Education, local government, is that in many of our communities, and I think Jessie-Anne said it, I want to know who impregnated these girls and what is being done when a 14-year-old is pregnant. Who is the person who impregnated a 14-year-old, and what are the consequences for that for that 14-year-old? And the law is very clear. When you are the first person that sees a child and you see that they had been abused, you need to act. So if a child carries a pregnancy to term, who did they see first? When they walked into the clinic, who did they see? What did that person do? What was the follow-up? That is the kind of accountability. Who reported? Who blew the whistle? And when the whistle was blown, who investigated? And I think we need to be asking these questions about these statistics rather than just rattling them out as statistics.
Is it time to revisit our comprehensive sexuality education in particular when we are talking about adolescents?
So when we speak about comprehensive sexuality education, and I think it's an important element of it, young people know the information. Why can't they act on it? That's the question we need to ask ourselves. They are not sleeping with themselves. They are sleeping with older men. So yes, continue giving them comprehensive sexuality education. But when you can really see at 14 that it is child abuse, you need to treat it as child abuse. Giving young people comprehensive sexuality education only without holding men accountable says to them, it's your responsibility to prevent the pregnancy. Where are we having an education that says to men, you are a predator and a rapist when you sleep with a 14-year-old?
Devastating to the social fabric of society. Are we going to, Jessie-Anne, at a later stage be counting the economic costs, particularly when it speaks to the mental health of the teenagers, but also the children that they are bearing? Jessie-Anne?
So I think when we think about the costs, these are significant. Obviously we've sort of focused on the idea that we have this intergenerational trauma that can be carried forward. I also want to speak a little bit though around when we have this disconnect around parents. Again, I know we've spoken about how so much of this conversation is focused on the mothers and who they are, and we seem to have this gap or this question mark about the fathers. I think what this also then indicates is that when we have this lack of connection, we have this lack of fatherhood when it comes to teenagers and unplanned pregnancies, it then creates a deficit in multiple areas. One of those being in the economic. When you don't have a father claiming a child, that's 50% of an income that that child then doesn't have access to. That's a resource that they don't have in terms of their own livelihood, their own education, their food, their clothing. But what it also is is it's an experience of parenting that they don't have. It's a sense of belonging. And what we then see is when they don't have that sense of belonging, when they don't have that secure attachment to two parents, often then when they reach their own adolescence, they may find that they're seeking it. They may find that they want to feel that reassurance. And that very need is what might put them themselves then at risk of engaging in behaviors that put them at risk. And so we see this intergenerational impact on mental health. We see this intergenerational trauma, but then we also see an intergenerational risk of an unplanned early pregnancy, which is something that we see in research and we see it across the globe.
Yeah. Ladies, unfortunately, we're out of time. Let's leave it there for tonight. Thank you very much for coming through, Jessie-Anne Bird, as well as Lebo Ramafoko there with us, helping us with that conversation.